Yeah, so one of the things that comes to mind is you reference that something that happens in The Witness a lot is this payload comes in the form of gameplay. And I think you didn't linger on it too much in the intro there, but one of the other things that you did say is that a lot of people will in default to thinking about ideas in the space of a more conventional narrative, something that we can
Mhm.
relate to other mediums. We
Yeah.
spoke the last time you were here about in some ways games are very distinct from every other form of media, and I wanted to also drill down a little bit deeper on that, and maybe specifically in terms of how it relates to the idea of ideas and how idea payloads, as you term it, can be used in a very positive way to impart knowledge, to sort of fulfill this idea that the player is improving and either competence in the face of challenge or at least like problem solving skills in the face of a puzzle that's maybe less mechanically demanding like a game like Counter-Strike, but still obviously has its own problem solving skills associated with resolving it.
Mhm.
So what do you think about that? Because for me, when I look at most games, yeah, a lot of the ideas that are at play require you to do things that are decidedly not game related. They're not about walking around and interacting with the world and, telling your own story, if you want to use that term, paving your own path through the universe. They're more about you being on rails in a cutscene and bearing witness to something, some ideas that other people have come up with, and either by themselves or in a committee or what have you. So do you think that in this way games are not leveraging what is different about them, and in what ways do you think that games are equipped to best use this payload thing? What would you say to those ideas?
I mean, it's a really hard problem. So I've been dissatisfied with the way story-based games, let's say, right? There's this whole genre, or it's not even a genre because it crosses the gameplay genres, but like there's this kind of game where the developers they have some traditional linear story, right? And it's a big part of what they're delivering to you as the experience, right? And I've been very dissatisfied with that kind of game for a long time. I actually gave some speeches in 2007 and 2008 that are still on YouTube about what I thought were the fundamental problems with that model. And those speeches are pretty old now. And if I were to do a new version, I'm not sure how much more refined I would be about it. I'm not sure that I have new thoughts about it actually, because I haven't really seen anyone do a better job. Um, but there's sort of two problems. One problem is the story is fighting the gameplay, in that gameplay is about deciding what happens by your interactivity. Otherwise, your interactivity didn't matter, right? But these pre-baked stories like don't really let anything happen. Sometimes they're branching, and then you have a trivial amount of branching or whatever, right? Um, and then the other problem is, and this is, I think, less appreciated even by people in the industry, because like everyone in the industry understands the first thing, they just don't care that much, right? Um, but the second thing is actually um, having it be a game kind of wrecks your story, like in ways that are, some of them are obvious, but some of them are really subtle and not understood. And all I'm going to say there is, okay, so gamers get excited about stories in certain games sometimes, right? Like, hey, oh my God, this game has such a good story, but you always have to put at the end of whatever they said, for a game, right? For a game, this game has a really good story, right? And a thing that has always seemed very obvious to me, and you know, people in the game playing audience will argue about this, but I think they're just wrong. Um, is that if you go look at the best stories from other media, right? They're just way, way, way better than the stories we have in games. Like we can't even get close to them, right? So one of the examples that I use, it's genuinely one of my favorite books, but this example annoys people because they think it's like, I don't know, too pretentious or something because it's a complicated book. But one of my favorite books is the novel Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. And I've read that 3 times, and it's coming to be about time to read it again. But every time I read it, I just love it so much. it is so complicated. Like the first chapter of that book has more ideas than like any 5 games I've ever played have in their stories, like put together, right? And that's like before the story even really gets started. Um, and but you don't have to go that extreme, but because that book, it has a reputation for being complicated. It's hard to understand a little bit, right? Because it doesn't go out of its way to be understood, and it's kind of having fun with being a little bit cryptic and so forth, right? But pick anything, I don't know, like um you could even pick a shorter book, like you know one of my favorite shorter books is in Invisible Cities by Calvino, right? It's like a collection of vignettes, and it's, I don't know, it's 120 pages or something. It's not huge. And it's just so nice, and it's got so much in it. Um and like the stories we see in games are not that at all, right? Um they're much more simplistic. They're much more like what I mean, here we get into all sorts of difficult things. Okay, so I think most people who've thought about it are familiar with the idea that, somehow a book just has a lot more story information in it than like a movie, right? So if you adapt a book to a movie, like a one novel to one like 2-hour movie or 90-minute movie, you end up cutting out a lot of the minor plot points of the novel. You end up cutting out or combining or simplifying a lot of characters because you don't have that much space in the movie, right? um when you do a game, it seems to be an even more simplified, there's like even less room for story sophistication somehow in a game than a movie, and it seems to be even more simplified and condensed. um And I don't know why that is. That's pretty weird because you certainly sit in front of a game for much longer, right? But then the second thing that happens with a game is that because we're copying movies as an industry a lot of the time with all the way we do cutscenes and stuff, we think we learned stuff from movies. Like, oh, here's the cinematography language that they have, and let's put the camera at this angle and stuff. But we kind of autistically learned it, and I don't mean that to be offensive, but I mean it to say, um, like we're missing something basic about it. Like, what makes when you put a camera angle on an actor in a certain way and you're like close upping their face or whatever. Part of the reason that's interesting is because the actor is a human being who's a good actor and has a lot of like nuance going on in their face and stuff that we have, lots of evolutionary history in like knowing how to decode, right? And like the lighting in the room is a certain way that's very subtle and all this stuff. And you try to do this with like computer generated skeletal animation video game characters, and like none of that stuff is there. So you watch this cutscene and it's like it doesn't have almost any of the information that's supposed to be there for your brain to think this is interesting. And we don't understand that as an industry, right? So we just do the cutscene. And uh I don't know. So if you're impressed by, oh, this game is almost like a movie, isn't that so great? Then these cutscenes seem great because they've increased in sophistication and whatever. But if you actually watch good movies and you care about like actually seeing interesting things on the screen that have, like, if people see movies for different reasons, but I don't know, like almost nothing that is important on a movie screen ends up in the game cutscene equivalent. I'll say that, right? So, what are we even doing, right? And the answer is we're doing this relatively crass commercial calculation where it's just games have been about impressing people for a long time. High budget games have been about impressing people, and this has actually changed a little bit recently, and I think we'll get to that. But in the olden days, in the 80s and 90s, and even the early 2000s, it was about like having better graphics than the last game, and you bought your game in a box in the store, and so it was like as long as you had the good screenshots to put on the box in the store or in the magazine ad, that was how you sold your game and that was how you hyped it and all that, right? And then, eventually, well, we stopped buying games in stores, but also we sort of reached this peak where graphics technically matter a little less. You still, the highest budget games even still do that today, but it's much less prominent. So it sort of became other stuff. Like whichever, I think it was Grand Theft Auto 4 that was one of the first games that like copied all the movie camera angles and stuff, and their credits are all like, hey, it's the credits of a movie. And like reviewers went apeshit over that because they hadn't seen that before. It became like the new way to impress people with the magnitude and sophistication of your thing somehow, right?